Many parents notice a gradual shift as their children reach adulthood. There is no argument, no dramatic conversation, no clear turning point, just a quiet realization. Their adult child no longer needs them in the same way. Decisions get made without asking first. Problems get solved independently. Less is shared about what is happening in their life, not because something went wrong, but because something changed. For many parents, this shift is surprisingly painful, even when they know it is normal, even when they genuinely want their child to become independent. Something about the distance still feels unsettling. Parents often explain it to themselves in familiar ways. They tell themselves their child is busy, that adulthood simply looks like this, that every family goes through it. And all of that may be true, but sometimes there is another layer beneath that discomfort. Because for some parents, letting go is not just emotionally difficult, it can feel almost impossible. Not out of a need for control, and not out of selfishness, but because the relationship between parent and child became so deeply intertwined that separation feels less like change and more like loss. Psychologists refer to this dynamic as emotional enmeshment. Understanding it can meaningfully change how parents interpret this difficult transition. When distance begins to appear in a relationship with an adult child, parents typically look for explanations. Often, those explanations point outward: a partner's influence, the pressures of work, generational differences in communication. Sometimes the explanation turns inward. A parent begins to wonder whether they said something wrong, became too critical, or pushed their child away without realizing it. In many families, these interpretations generate quiet tension. The parent feels confused and hurt. The adult child senses pressure or misunderstanding. But in many cases, the situation was not caused by a single event. There was no argument, no betrayal, no sudden shift in personality. What is happening is more gradual and structural. As children become adults, the psychological organization of the relationship has to change. The closeness that once felt natural begins to require clearer boundaries. When those boundaries were never fully developed in earlier years, this transition becomes unusually difficult. The distance parents notice is not always rejection. It is often the first visible sign that the relationship is trying to reorganize itself in a healthier, more independent direction. Emotional enmeshment describes a relationship in which the emotional boundaries between two people have become blurred. In a healthy parent-child relationship, closeness exists alongside a clear sense of separateness. The parent cares deeply about the child's experiences, but each person retains their own distinct emotional world. In enmeshed relationships, that distinction erodes. The parent becomes so closely attuned to the child's life that the child's choices, moods, and problems begin to directly affect the parent's own emotional stability. The child, in turn, often grows up feeling responsible for the parent's feelings. If the child is unhappy, the parent becomes distressed. If the child makes a decision the parent dislikes, it can feel personally threatening. And if the child begins to pull away, the parent may experience that distance as rejection rather than development. Emotional enmeshment rarely comes from bad intentions. It typically develops in families where love, sacrifice, and involvement were genuinely strong. The parent may have devoted enormous time and energy to raising the child. The child may have been the central source of meaning in the parent's life. For many years, this level of closeness can feel entirely natural, but when the child reaches adulthood, relationships organized around emotional fusion face a difficult reality. A fully independent adult cannot exist without psychological space. Enmeshment rarely appears suddenly. It usually develops slowly over many years, often without either parent or child recognizing it while it is forming. It frequently begins with deep dedication. A parent invests heavily in raising the child. Time, attention, and personal sacrifices become part of daily life. The child's needs, achievements, and struggles gradually take center stage. For a long time, this level of involvement feels appropriate. Parenting often requires placing a child's well-being above other priorities. But in some cases, the child becomes more than someone the parent cares for. The child becomes the parent's primary emotional focus. Other parts of life, friendships, personal interests, individual identity, slowly move into the background. The relationship with the child begins to carry a deeper emotional weight than any other. Sometimes the child also becomes a quiet, emotional support for the parent. A parent may share worries, frustrations, or personal struggles in ways that blur the line between parent and confidant. The child learns, often without fully realizing it, that their role is not only to be cared for, but also to help stabilize the parent emotionally. None of this necessarily feels unhealthy while the child is young. It can look, from the outside, like a particularly close and loving family bond, but over time, the roles become tightly intertwined. Rather than two separate emotional worlds connected by care, the relationship begins to function as a shared emotional system. And when adulthood arrives, that system faces a challenge it was never designed to handle. An adult life requires independence. New priorities emerge. Careers develop. Romantic relationships become central. Decisions increasingly belong to the individual rather than to the family. From the adult child's perspective, this shift is part of normal psychological growth. Independence allows them to build their own identity, make their own mistakes, and develop trust in their own judgment. From the parent's perspective, however, the experience can feel very different. The daily closeness that once defined the relationship begins to loosen. Phone calls may become less frequent. Advice may be asked for less often. Important decisions may be shared only after they are already made. For parents whose sense of identity was deeply tied to being needed, this transition can feel disorienting, as though the relationship itself is weakening. In reality, the bond is not disappearing. It is changing its structure. The child is moving from dependence toward autonomy. In healthy relationships, this shift eventually produces a different kind of closeness, one based on mutual respect rather than guidance. But when emotional enmeshment has shaped the earlier relationship, this transition can feel less like a natural evolution and more like a painful separation. Part of the difficulty lies in how identity develops over time. For many years, being a parent is not simply one role among many. It becomes a central part of how a person understands themselves. Daily life is organized around protecting, guiding, and supporting the child. A sense of purpose grows from being needed. When the child becomes independent, that structure begins to dissolve. The parent may no longer be the first person the child turns to. Problems are handled privately. Major decisions are made without consultation. Even when parents understand intellectually that this is a normal stage of development, the emotional experience can still feel deeply unsettling. The difficulty is not always about control. It is often about the absence of a role that once provided meaning and stability. If the parent's emotional world became closely organized around the child's life, separation can feel like losing a part of oneself. Letting go, in this context, is not simply about allowing the child to live independently. It also requires the parent to reconstruct a sense of identity that is no longer defined by constant involvement in the child's life. For the adult child, the experience of an enmeshed relationship carries its own weight. From the outside, the family may appear simply close or supportive. But internally, the adult child often feels a subtle pressure that is difficult to name. They may sense that their choices carry emotional consequences for their parent. Selecting a different path in life, moving to another city, or forming priorities outside the family can create a feeling of having disappointed someone they care about. This pressure does not always appear directly. It surfaces in quieter ways. A shift in tone, a moment of sadness when plans change, a subtle disappointment when the child does not ask for guidance. Over time, the adult child begins to recognize that their independence affects the emotional balance of the relationship. This can produce an uncomfortable sense of responsibility. Rather than feeling free to build their own life, They may feel obligated to manage their parents' reactions. For many adult children, creating distance becomes the most straightforward way to reduce that burden. Stepping back allows them to make decisions without feeling observed or emotionally accountable for someone else's stability. To the parent, this distance can feel confusing and painful. For the child, it is often simply an attempt to create the psychological space that adulthood requires. Healthy separation between parents and adult children does not mean the relationship weakens. It means the structure changes. In childhood, closeness is built around dependence. Parents guide decisions, offer protection, and serve as the primary emotional support in the child's life. Adulthood gradually shifts that structure. The adult child begins making decisions independently. Advice may still be welcomed, but it is no longer required. Conversations become less about guidance and more about exchanging perspectives. In healthy relationships, this transition produces a different kind of connection. Rather than being based on necessity, the bond becomes voluntary. The adult child chooses when to call, when to visit, and when to share important moments. The parent remains significant but no longer occupies the central organizing role in the child's life. For parents, this stage can feel quieter than earlier years. But quieter does not mean lesser. Relationships built on mutual respect and emotional independence often become more stable over time. When the pressure of constant involvement is removed, both people are able to engage with each other as separate individuals rather than as roles that must be maintained. Letting go of an adult child is often described as one of the more difficult transitions in family life, not because the relationship is ending, but because it is changing form. For many years, closeness was built around guidance, protection, and being needed. As children become adults, that structure gradually gives way to something quieter, a relationship between two separate individuals. When emotional enmeshment has shaped the earlier bond, this transition can feel like loss. But in many cases, it marks the beginning of a healthier balance. Independence allows the adult child to build their own life, and in doing so, it creates space for a different kind of connection with their parents, one less dependent on roles and expectations and more grounded in respect, distance, and genuine choice.